For a lot of white people, the words white privilege is simply code for racist. White privilege is not a new concept. It has been talked about in some form or other since the 1800s. In America, the National Council of the Congressional Churches of the United States started exploring this idea in 1910. And in 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America truly articulated it when he wrote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes elected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them." However, it was Peggy McIntosh's 1987 White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, that seemed to bring this idea into clearer focus for our age. So, what is white privilege? And what does it have to do with me? This is Loki Mulholland, and it's time to get uncomfortable. To help us talk about white privilege, I invited a special guest. Curtis Linton is the co-author of Courageous Conversations About Race, Version 1, and the founder of the Domino Foundation, a nonprofit organization established to provide support for families that adopt transracially by offering multicultural learning and social opportunities. Curtis is also featured in the award-winning film Black, White, and Us, which is about racism through the lens of transracial adoptions. Well, welcome, Curtis.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
How are you doing?
These are fascinating times. So Doing all right, but truly, we're in an age where consciousness of color is higher than I've ever personally witnessed. And there's an idea that privilege may have a role to play in what's going on in this country in terms of all the protests and the marches and whatnot since the George Floyd killing. But I'm not sure privilege has yet entered the conversation. And so it's one thing to understand that there's a different experience for people of color in our country, that this country wasn't designed to support the success and the full integration of people of color. It's a critical thing which has to be acknowledged in our country for us to ever move forward. But what that doesn't speak to is the power structures that have led to these inequities. And so a conversation around privilege, white privilege, be very specific about this. When I say privilege, I'm talking about white privilege. A conversation around privilege starts to get to the roots, to the power structures that allow these inequities to persist. And so we may talk about police reform. Of course. Yeah. Let's even defund the police. Let's invest in the community. There we go. We got our solution, right? It's a Band-Aid. It'll move us forward in one direction, but it won't exactly solve anything. Because privilege is the power structure that exists to support all of the inequities. And there's a phrase that's used, and it's a pretty harsh one, but it's the oppressor will turn to the oppressed to learn how to overcome the oppression. And so if the oppressed, the dispossessed, the discriminated and prejudiced against are people of color within this country, well, the white community is very conditioned to turn to people of color and say, what do I do? Oh my gosh, this is so upsetting. What should I do? Will you tell me about it? What is it like being Black? What is it? Tell me about these inequities. Wow, I did not know. But never turn back and say, what role does my life play in this?
Right.
And not just, who did I vote for last time? Well, I didn't vote for Trump. I guess I'm on the side of racial equality, right? Yeah. Except for I'm willing to take COVID and sit in my home and not work for 3 months and not exactly consider the needs of working people who are mostly people of color. It's like I can't believe people are walking around outside at this time of great danger. Why aren't they just in their homes? They're putting us all at risk. Well, that person may be roughly 24 hours away from losing their housing,
Right.
being able to feed their kids. And so getting into privilege, I mean, I think one of the first things to tackle with privilege.
Well, before we even tackle that, I want to jump back a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Which is wise. I love to jump into privilege, and is the quickest way I lose white people in the conversation.
This is why we're having this conversation. I knew you would, but I want to. Well, first, Curtis, just for the record, so people know you're white.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just make sure.
Yep, right. I'm white.
Yes. What was your aha moment when it came to race and racism?
Okay, so yeah, I've been reflecting a lot on this. Again, to this current time, because I've had multiple friends and family members reach out with a greater race conscious than I've ever witnessed in them, and so I've been reflecting back on my own journey through this. And so my first exposure to race goes back to 2002. Mm. And so at the time, I was living in Los Angeles, living in Koreatown either. So I was having what I called at the time my ethnic experience, because Koreatown is less than 10% white. So I felt very, courageous and progressive to live in such a diverse part of Los Angeles. I had finished film school. I was working on educational documentaries. And key to this is understanding that I grew up Mormon. And so I have this Mormon heritage. Mm-hmm. And part of growing up Mormon, particularly growing up Mormon in Utah, is that you're taught from a very young age about the history of persecution to the Mormon community. Right. And so you are taught and conditioned to understand that as a Mormon, you are different in the world. And people will
and part of that, just for the record, so people understand, not everyone knows this persecution. We're talking the Hans Mill Massacre. We're talking about the extermination order put on them by the governor of Missouri.
Yeah. I mean, really,
all these sort of things.
The reason why Mormonism ends up in Utah is because Mormons as a group were chased from New York to Ohio to Missouri to Illinois. And they finally, and there's a whole history to get into, which is really fascinating around this. Their leader at the time literally led them into Mexico, because Utah at the time was part of Mexico. So they escaped the U.S. They left the U.S.
So they were illegal immigrants to Mexico.
As a whole population. Yeah. Talk about a caravan coming, right? This was truly a caravan that was coming to settle. Never made that connection before. So they come to the Salt Lake Valley, and I was always taught that it was uninhabited. Of course, now we know that there were, successful, thriving indigenous populations within this valley that were displaced. Yeah. So my ancestors come into the Salt Lake Valley, and it's more or less a desert valley next to an inland sea. And they settle because they are so far away from every center of, government per se, that they're not going to be bothered. And that is to escape the persecution, some of the instances that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So I'm raised up with that. So I have this idea, I go to France for 2 years at 19 years old to be a Mormon missionary. And so I go through this whole experience of having to share who I am and what I believe in an effort to basically convert people to my faith.
Right. And an interesting aspect of that, of that sense of that own sense of persecution, because, I'm an active Latter-day Saint. That's a badge we love to wear. Mm-hmm. But how our inability to empathize with other people's persecution. Yeah. Right. So white Latter-day Saints are very quick to throw that out there, but not recognize that for anyone else. And I hear that a lot from white people in general. The Irish, look how they were treated, when they first came here. Okay, well, shouldn't that be an indication to you that, you should be an ally with what's taking place right now? I mean, anyways.
Well, so what you're saying there weaves into my own discovery of race. Mm-hmm. So here I am living in Los Angeles with my wife. I just finished film school at USC. I was the only person who was married in my entire, cohort. Right. I was the only white person who went to church. Mm-hmm. I was, politically shifting more and more to the left during that time, but the only white person who went to church and even would witness things. I was co-producing a short film with a black gentleman, and we would shoot on Sundays. And so one Sunday we show up to set, and he's like, "Hey, y'all, I'm going to leave for about an hour at 10 to go to church."
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the crew, which is mostly white, is like, "Oh, that's cool. Yeah." Kind of thinking, oh, African-American church, call and response. That's awesome.
Right. Yeah.
What an experience. And I'm watching him do this. I'm like, hey, okay, this is cool. I can request the same thing next Sunday. So the next Sunday comes around, I'm like, hey, everybody, I'm going to leave for an hour to go to church. You go to church? And there's this whole thing that comes back at me, like white conservative. And it was incredibly unsettling. And it felt at the time as though myself and this black man were getting different treatment.
My work has taken me to a lot of places, and I've been fortunate to meet some incredible people. But when I came to Selma and met Joanne Blackman Bland, I knew I was in the presence of greatness. Joanne was 11 years old when she was attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in 1965. She wasn't old enough to vote, but understood its importance enough to be there. After Selma is an in-depth look at how our right to vote has eroded since the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The fight for the right to vote continues. Get informed. You can find After Selma on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection.
Okay, so this is all part of my experience that's building up. A feeling, a sense of difference tied to my Mormon heritage. Someone in my class who asked in all sincerity if my other wife was living in Utah. And it's like, oh my gosh, I have to explain my people again. And so all of this is building up. And so 2002 comes, and I'm invited to film and direct this educational documentary on an educator named Glenn Singleton. So Glenn is black man, grew up in Baltimore, lives in San Francisco, and created this approach to understanding race called Courageous Conversations About Race. And so we're going to do a video program on him. So I fly up to Oakland, and we're there for the first day of the workshop. And he goes all day, and it's so impassioned, and it's a mixed race crowd. They're all educators from Oakland or from the surrounding area, and I'm listening to Glenn talk about being black. The fact that he went to an all Jewish prep high school. He's one of two black people in the whole school, and how isolated, how misunderstood he felt. And in each of these things, I'm connecting to my own experience. Shocking. I mean, it's we, as humans, we tend to be pretty good at that. We hear someone else explain something, and we're thinking, have I gone through something similar? And whatever I attach to as similar, I'm going to use to rewrite the experience someone else is telling me about. So I'm taking everything Glenn is talking about in terms of discrimination and prejudice and bias and whatnot, and I'm pushing it through my personal lens of my Mormon heritage and what that means. I'm rewriting it. I'm rewriting Glenn's experience so that I can better understand it. It's a very human thing to do. So we go through that first day, and one of the things that Glenn said at the end of that first day, and I'm not going to stop at this, the story continues beyond, but it's one of the most profound lessons around race that I've ever had. I've actually written a little bit about it during this time. It's been fascinating to see people respond to it. But the end of the day comes, and there's this very passionate female white educator who's like, I hear you. Oh my gosh, I am so moved right now. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do to end racism? And Glenn looks at her and he's like, believe me, that's it. She's like, but what do I do? What action? What's the next thing I should do? We need to put a plan in place. And Glenn's response is, believe me. Just believe me. And so Glenn planted that seed in my mind. Now, I'm still stuck on my Mormon heritage. We fly to Denver. He does another same presentation. So now I've sat through the same presentation 2 days in a row. We fly to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Sit through it again. So I've now sat through 3 days of basically the same presentation, hearing Glenn define race, describe racism, explore institutionalized racism. It took me 3 days for it to finally start to resonate. Remember, the seed was planted, believe me. And so there we are at the end of this third day. I've sat through it again. And Glenn and I both remember this moment to this day very clearly. And we're sitting at this little restaurant in Chapel Hill called Crook's Corner. And I'm having shrimp and grits for the first time. We're outdoors on the patio. We're both having shrimp and grits. We can tell you where the sun is, what the weather's like, the whole thing. So we're sitting there having this discussion. Oh my gosh, Glenn, I get it. And he looks at me and he kind of smiles a little bit and nods his head. I said, when I walk in the room, I have to announce my Mormon heritage in order to invite any of the misjudgments that might apply.
Mm-hmm.
And when you walk in the room, he goes, exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody knows you're black. It's already announced.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds so simple, right? I mean, I had already achieved a top degree master's degree and all the rest. I mean, and all this education, traveling around the world, all these experiences, and I had never boiled the experience of race down to the simplicity of how we interpret the tone and the shade of another person's skin. This is where it gets interesting, because now we have to explore race versus racism versus institutionalized racism.
Right.
So race fundamentally is just the label we put on a person's skin, on their skin color.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Black, white, etc. It's just an identifier. So to say someone is black is not in and of itself racist.
No, of course not.
So racism are the judgments that hang on that label. And so I have a judgment tied to someone's skin color. So I can acknowledge someone is black. So I mean, this is where, colorblind ideology, all the rest, is very destructive, because someone is actually that color, and we have hundreds of years of history which places identity on that skin color, even if genetically there is, in essence, no difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I can acknowledge someone's color. I don't need to be colorblind. Colorblind is it's blind to all the issues, and I think for the most part, the majority of our country has moved past the idea that colorblindness is somehow, a worthy ambition.
Right.
So, but then racism is, what is someone's skin color and what judgments do I attach to that skin color? Now, remember, I said judgments, not negative judgments, because these can be seemingly positive judgments as well.
Mm-hmm.
I remember distinctly near this time, a friend of mine, an Asian female, through the film program at USC, she would talk about how her whole life she was always shoved into gifted and talented math classes.
Right.
She hated math, absolutely hated it. She could not convince her teachers to just let her be in a regular math class. Well, how many of us would love for the school to think that we're really good at math?
Right.
That seems like a positive thing, right? But it wasn't her. So there was a judgment being placed upon her with her identity that wasn't reflective of who she actually was. So this is also where we have to jump ahead a little bit, past my discovery of race. So I began understanding race intellectually in my work with Glenn,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a complete drinking at the fire hose moment. I mean, I was starting from not just a place of ignorance, but a place of naivety when it comes to race. So I go through a few years of this education, and Glenn invites me to co-author the first version of Courageous Conversations about race with him. And so we spend 2 years going back and forth writing this.
Mm-hmm.
Profound experience, very tough experience, but a very profound experience. It's shifted me for life, as you can imagine. But roughly 2 months after I finish all of my work on that book, and that book is selling to this day, it's been a top seller in education circles. It's been really, widely read and well received. And we're 15 years past its publication.
Right.
But about 2 months after I completed my work on it, a birth mother from Louisiana selected my wife and I to adopt her son that she was about to give birth to.
Right.
And so my son was born. So I go through this whole process of co-authoring courageous conversations about race as a white man. And then suddenly I find myself as the father of a black boy.
In my other life, I'm a filmmaker, and one of my more fascinating films I created is the award-winning film titled Black, White, and Us. It's about viewing racism through the lens of transracial adoptions in Utah. Utah? Yeah, Utah. It just so happens to be the transracial adoption capital of the world. So what happens when white families who didn't believe racism existed anymore adopts a black child? Find it on Amazon Prime, or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection. Yeah, and I want to jump on that for a moment here because so you and your wife, you've adopted 2 black children,
Mm-hmm.
and into a very white world of Utah, right?
Fully, yes.
And clearly, this gave you this whole different perspective on how the world sees your children. But there's one story in particular that I thought that was in the film Black, White, and Us. I thought was particularly enlightening. That I think it would help bring this into focus as well. Is it's when you're in the court. I think it's you're in the courthouse, and the adoption agency tells you about the discount you're going to get on your child.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you adopt, particularly when you adopt at birth, as we had, so first birth mother reads through various profiles and selects us as a couple. It's a very emotional, even a spiritual type experience,
Right.
getting to know this birth mother.
And in the film, we talk about that a little bit in regards to you guys also have to check out some boxes. Like,
Yes.
okay, and I don't want, go watch the film for the details on that, but it's a fascinating exploration of oneself of, is it okay to, if I didn't check off the box, those sort of things, but.
Oh, this is white guilt to its greatest degree.
Yes.
Of course I could love any child, so I'll accept every race.
Right.
So birth mother, it is truly white guilt to the greatest degree. And you make this choice with no one ever checking whether or not you have knowledge around race and racism.
Right.
So it's an ignorant choice in a naive situation, which leads to lots of white parents adopting kids of color and then having to discover race after they are now raising a child of color. But in any case, we adopt Dominic. And so here I am as a father holding a black boy in my arms, and I love this boy beyond anything I've ever experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So 6 months after placement, you go into the courthouse and a judge finalizes the adoption. And so according to all legal paperwork, the adoption is finalized. We are a fundamental family, and afforded all the legal rights that go along with that. So 6 months after Dom's birth, we're going up to the courthouse, just about to enter, and our social worker from the adoption agency is at the door with us. And she says, and it was just kind of an aside comment, "Oh, you're so lucky that he was just labeled as full African American, where he's actually mixed race. So he's technically a quarter Filipino. Mm-hmm. If he would have been listed as mixed race, it would have cost $4,000 more."
Right. So you save some money.
Yeah, we saved some money. Oh, we're so lucky that he's full black. Hold on a moment. And so I hate to admit this, we had heard about race-based pricing, but we had not fully explored it. We had not double-checked that the agency we were with, and whether or not they practice this concept of race-based pricing. Mm-hmm. And suddenly the social worker lets us know. So the thing is, agencies that practice this will never show you a list of costs.
Right.
Full black, $15,000, white, $50,000.
Yeah.
That's what our agency was charging. And this was full day in, day out practice. And we did not understand that was the practice going on. I mean, just think about that. Black child, $15,000, white child, $50,000, 50.
It's a reflection of how we value race in America.
It's a reflection of how skin and, a living human being is treated as property.
Right.
I mean, this goes back to the founding, to the slave origins of our country. I mean, this is where the 1609 Project, the New York Times did, I believe is fundamental learning that white people need to go through to understand how deliberately the idea of black as property was developed in this country.
So I mean, let's really dive into white privilege here on this. So
Okay, so this is part of the journey, because remember, when I started working with Glenn, it was intellectual. It was intellectually coming to understand race is skin color. Racism is the judgments that I place on that skin color. Institutionalized racism is how organizations, create and perpetuate inequity.
mhm,
And so I can, in essence, see myself as a non-racist. I mean, this is working with educators is very fascinating around this, because you show up to a room of educators and talk about race, and they'll all tell you none of them are racist. Otherwise, they'd never become a teacher,
right,
except for their institution, their organization has incredibly inequitable outcomes. So they
right,
may see themselves as non-racist, but they are a full participant and perpetuator in institutionalized racist outcomes.
yes,
And so racism, institutionalized racism, intellectually understanding this. Now I'm a white father of black children, adopted my son, adopted my daughter, who is full African American. I'm fathering two black kids in a very white world. Okay, so now it starts to become very personal. Remember, part of what led us into this part of the conversation was talking about positive attributes tied to race.
yes, yes,
So my son has incredibly long legs and really long fingers. He's tall and skinny.
mhm,
We had a friend who flat out said to us, "Oh my gosh, you're lucky. He's going to go to the NBA and make you a millionaire."
right,
I mean, and my friend, who's a big sports fan, was like, "Man, you just hit the
jackpot.
jackpot. Aren't you lucky?" It's like, well, hold on. What would make you say this?
Mhm,
Black and tall. He never came up to me and said, "Wow, your son has such long, skinny fingers. Maybe he's going to be an amazing pianist."
right,
Because that doesn't fit the racial stereotype.
mhm,
So, so the reason why racism are the judgments that we attach to skin is because we're allowing skin color to predetermine someone else's characteristics and outcomes, whether positive or negative. And so it's not just a matter of fighting, people who use the N word and people who are outwardly bigoted and whatnot. It's fighting all stereotypes. It's fighting any judgment tied to somebody because of their skin color. So, but now I'm seeing my children start to grow up in this. And it was wild because I'd done some work on filming Beverly Daniel Tatum several years earlier. So she's the one who wrote the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she's really the scholar behind the idea of racial identity development. And so having spent some time learning from her and now raising my children and seeing them move almost lockstep within those stages of racial identity development.
mhm,
So they're growing up in a white family, and yet they're still going through the same stages that she had identified. And so it begins with, your young child putting their arm next to yours
right,
just to compare. That's it. That's the first stage, is just an acknowledgement that skin has different colors. And then that's kind of a pre-kindergarten type of acknowledgement. As they go into the early elementary grades, it's, "Oh, I'm of one skin color, you're of another skin color." That's it. As they go into the upper elementary grades, it's, "Oh, my skin color is different from the others."
mhm,
So starting to feel a little bit set apart. As they go into middle school, it's starting to identify with other people of their own color.
mhm,
And then as they go into high school, it's starting to understand the cultural attributes and the judgments and identities and characteristics tied with that skin color.
right,
And I have watched my kids, both of them, go through this. And so that's, those are stages of development. But then there's also, the bigotry of low expectations. So think about this. My children have parents who both have had careers in education,
mhm,
known for our knowledge around how good schools work. And yet when we walk in the school with them, white parent, black child, they are completely treated with the bigotry of low expectations.
Mm.
I mean, a close friend of ours who was our daughter's elementary teacher one year knew she was behind substantially, but loved her so much that she never called it out. Allowed my daughter to go through 3/4 of the school year with turning no work in. I'd already done workshops with that school. They knew my belief and my passion for education. And I think it was actually the same year that this teacher was allowing my daughter to turn in nothing and never told us about it. Talk about the bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah.
So my daughter's just behind and just hanging out there because no one is stepping in to shift her educational progress.
Mm-hmm.
My son goes through multiple experiences. Particularly as he goes into middle school and he starts becoming very acute to this. He and a friend of his who is also African-American, they're riding the school bus home, and they get home and they're like, yeah, we decided to count how many black people we saw on the streets here in Salt Lake City.
Mm.
Fascinating. That's a stage of this development. They're now starting to count and see how isolated they are. The use of the N-word and seeing how my son responds to that. Intensely, deeply personal. That I'm a father of 2 black kids, and I'm seeing the personal impact of this. I'm seeing them live this. My mother takes a photo of all of the grandkids together, her 25, 30 grandkids, and there's 2 kids of color in there, both my children. And to see how isolating that image is, so to really start to personalize my children's experience. Wow, I mean, this is what it means to be black in today's America. And I'm seeing this through my kids, knowing that I have never lived this. But I'm really close to my kids. I will live and die for them every day. So it is deeply personal, even if I have not gone through it. But it's in that recognizing that they're now living an experience that I never went through, where I really start to understand the need to explore privilege.
Mm.
Because I've intellectualized my children's experience. I've personalized my children's experience. But what I haven't done is understand my own. And that's privilege. And so can I fully understand what my kids are experiencing if I don't have an equally clear understanding of my own?
An Ordinary Hero was my first award-winning documentary. It's about the life of my mother, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, and her participation in the civil rights movement. For most of us, our mothers are heroes because they're mothers, and mom is just mom. But when your mother's a civil rights icon, and yet you never really knew it, things change. Go check out An Ordinary Hero and find out how choosing to do what was right instead of what was easy helped change the world. You can find it on Amazon Prime, or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection.
So let me give you a little analogy around this.
All right.
So driving while black or brown. What is driving while black or brown? Loki, I hand that to you. Define it for us.
Driving while black or brown? Well, it's the assumption of guilt, for one thing. I mean, that's in a nutshell, guilty from birth. But driving while black or brown is when you are driving and you have to be aware of every situation around you, and that if you get pulled over, a friend of mine, Martin Lynch, says, when he gets pulled over, he has to realize, even before he gets into the car, where is my wallet? Because he doesn't want to have to reach for it and for the police officer to think he's reaching for a gun.
Mm-hmm.
I never have to think about that. I just get in my car, put the key in the ignition, and I go.
Yeah. Okay, so think about this. Think about how this plays out from, white versus black. Mm-hmm. So I could give you that definition as well. Lots of people could give this definition. I've had dozens of people in workshops, people of color talk about, how recent it was that they were last pulled over.
Right.
Pulled over for the broken taillight, pulled over for not quite knowing where they're going, pulled over for whatever reason. Is this your car? I mean, all these crazy questions that people of color are asked by, an officer who pulls them over, driving while black or brown. So my son is, about to turn 15. He can get his learner's permit. He's going to start driving here in the next year. So it is critical for me as his parent to understand driving while black or brown and make sure he understands it, right?
Mm-hmm.
For his own safety. This is critical knowledge that I have to take on. So, but let's play this out. So if I have only gone through the exercise of understanding what it means to drive while black or brown, I teach my son right, how to drive. We go through all the rules. I make sure I even give him the talk about driving, keep your hands at, 10 and 2, make sure you know where your wallet is, be nice to the officer, the whole thing. I go through the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
My son's out. Just imagine he's driving. He comes home one night and he is completely rattled. He's been pulled over. Really emotional about him, as he should be, And I listen to him. On one hand, I'm mad because, man, that is racial profiling once again. Driving while black. This is so wrong. So if I've only learned what driving while black or brown means, I will include the question in my reaction. Are you sure you did nothing wrong?
Right.
So now I have to understand what it means to drive while white every bit as much as I need to understand what it means to drive while black or brown.
Mm-hmm.
So if I come to my son with an intellectual understanding of racial profiling, and my son experiences this, because it's an emotional moment, when we're caught up in our emotions, we use our personal lived experience as our template for how to judge a current situation.
Right. Well, that never happened to me. So clearly, what were you doing?
Exactly. So it's like, so I have to go through a strong exercise of thinking about every single time in my life when I've been pulled over. And if I'm honest about it, every time I was pulled over, I knew what I was doing wrong at the moment I got pulled over.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I was speeding. I knew I ran through that red light. It was conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so my response at the moment I'm pulled over is, oh crap, I've been caught. And so if I only intellectualize driving while black or brown, it's so wrong that cops do this, but in an emotional moment, I bring my personal experience to it. Okay, but what did you do wrong?
Right.
But what did you do wrong? And this is where my privilege has to be separated as being my experience, not being my child's. And so my privilege, which is every time I've been pulled over, I was doing something wrong and I was caught, is fundamentally not my child's experience. My child is living a fully different racial experience. And so if I turn to my child and say, okay, that's so wrong, I'm so mad at the cops, X, Y, and Z, but what, are you sure you're doing nothing wrong? What I'm telling my child at that moment is, I don't actually get you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand your experience. I only understand mine. And the most fundamental aspect of privilege is for me to assume that my life and the way it's lived is the primary template for everybody else.
Right.
It's fundamental privilege. I take my life and I use that as the measure of judgment for everyone else I come in contact with. And so when I come in contact with another middle-class, highly educated white person, I share most of the same experiences. And so my judgments are kind of limited. When I come in contact with someone of a different race, of a different background, of a different upbringing, of a different educational level, a different professional class, man, I've got 1,000 beyond points of judgment that I can render really, really fast. And this is as a person who's been working almost 20 years trying to address race and whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
This is every day for me, where I have to check myself and go, whoa, that was a wicked little judgment that just ran through my mind. Because it's natural. It's actually, when you think about how the brain works, fight or flight, right? Fight or flight is an emotional, not an intellectual response. We're wired to prioritize our emotional response over our intellectual response.
Mm-hmm.
And so if my judgments tend to be held on the emotional side of my brain, and I have not gone through and heavily examined those, then those judgments are always what will come to the forefront. My emotionally driven judgments, not my intellectually driven ones.
And that's interesting because this is where it really gets into this aspect of how whites respond to this concept of white privilege. So when you talk to whites about white privilege,
Oh, yeah.
the emotional response typically is, well, I'm not rich.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, I mean, obviously, privilege in this context really means advantage, or as I like to tell people, given the benefit of the doubt. But when you, so let me step back here. So Robin DiAngelo, obviously in her book White Fragility, she talks about how whites don't really see themselves as a race because we're normed. Everyone else is what's different. Ironically, whites are a minority in this world, so technically we should be the ones that are different. But um, it's only when we start to have it defined for us, whiteness, when we feel that it's being used against us, that suddenly we bristle. Now you take white and you take privilege and you put those two together, and that's just like this, this cocktail. And that's where whites begin to take it, and now it's personal. So they oftentimes will shut down and protect their whiteness, their privilege. Um, I was thinking about this as well, and now let's take this white privilege. Um, let me step back for a moment, actually. So prior to Peggy McIntosh's white privilege, really kind of defining that, white privilege was more viewed as in codified terms. So systemic advantages like slavery or Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
And then she and others started pushing this more of the psychological narrative, which actually benefits from the systemic. So in other words, today we don't have legal segregation, but because we're all downstream of the past, we benefit from that history, whereas African Americans, conversely, continue to suffer from it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we get to Black Lives Matter. And this aspect of when you start talking about white privilege, it suddenly there's this contrast of Black Lives Matter because it's really, I mean, now with both those terms being used, there's this perception of us versus them mentality, and so this is again where people start to shut down and not actually take a look at this. So there's this element amongst whites that won't admit to this privilege, but they feel that whites might recognize injustice against people of color, but they just don't conceptualize who's actually committing those injustices. And so they can sit there and see how everyone else can be affected by all of this, but not see themselves as being the ones that are benefiting from it all.
So what is interesting about this time is that I have had friends and family, I think I mentioned this earlier, who have reached out, really moved by this moment.
I had someone call me from Austria.
Yes.
So
I
I
mean,
mean, yeah.
So it's George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and even now Breonna Taylor. So these are so obvious that we can get behind them. That even Fox News is saying, yeah, that cop in Minnesota needs to be arrested. Okay, so we've passed the level of multiple interpretations. Now we're kind of unified in the interpretations of these last few experiences.
Right.
So this is why I have white friends from far back in my past, tend to be, traditionally quite conservative, reaching out and saying, wow, man, I'm moved. I need to have this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, on Wednesday, go to lunch with a couple of them. And one of the things that comes up is privilege. Yeah, I heard this dialogue last night, and they start right out, this black guy starts right out with talking about, the privilege that you have. And he goes, he's like, I so wanted to be there supporting that dialogue, but it just got my bristles up. Because, man, I work hard. I work really hard. And so when we hear privilege, again and again and again, it is reduced to some sort of economic status.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are white, lower economic status, it's, hey, I'm not rich. You can't tell me I have privilege. If you're wealthy and white, it's, I work hard. You can't tell me I have privilege. But neither of those actually describe what privilege is. And so one of the key definitions up front is distinguishing between entitlement and privilege. They're very different in how they act, even if the results may look the same.
Mm.
And so the most simplest way to break them apart is that entitlement is conscious, privilege is subconscious.
Mm.
So think about sitting in a restaurant and there's a person next to you who's just ugly with the server.
Right.
This is too cold. I didn't order it this way. Take it back now. Can I talk to your manager? That's entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
It's conscious. The person is deliberately saying, I'm going to utilize my power and influence to make the world the way I think it needs to be.
Mm.
That's entitlement. Privilege is just a subconscious expectation that the world is already the way I expect it to be.
Right.
So I don't need to be the ugly, entitled person, but I still get the same outcome.
Right. The world is centered around you and you
Yeah.
being white.
Yes. And so a large group of Black people protesting on the streets
Right.
disrupts the way I think the world should work.
Right.
I mean, this is listening to my representative, Chris Stewart, last Saturday night on the news after the protests in Salt Lake where
Right.
a police car was flipped, windows were broken, all the rest. And Chris Stewart, a white man, gets on the news and he's like, listen, just talk to us. Protesting's not the way to get us to listen. Just come sit down with me. We will find a way to fix this. Bullshit.
Right.
We've been talking about for years. The only reason you're now on the news talking about the protest is because of the protest.
Right.
It was the only thing which could grab your attention and potentially take the spotlight off of, in essence, the comfortable life that most whites in this country live and shine the spotlight on its inequities. So again, that is privilege. The privilege is disrupted. I feel really uncomfortable that the city I love has protesters and broken windows and all the rest. My privilege.
Because racism doesn't exist here. We love everybody.
Well, why can't we just have love? Why can't we just sit down and talk?
Right.
I mean, one of the most profound interviews was the head of the NAACP in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an interview from last week, and she said, let's be honest here. She said, I've spent a decade keeping this community from burning the city down. I've met with every governor, every mayor, every chief of police, and every single one of them says, I hear you, we'll make change.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I cannot keep this community down anymore. In essence, white leaders, you're reaping now what you've sown.
Yes.
You've listened, but you've never acted. And so the privilege response to that, maybe we'll use a different way to get your message across. The privilege response to that may also be, well, how do we change this? Well, let's make a plan. Let's organize a committee. Let's lay out some clear action steps and make sure we report back on them that we're making progress. We should just be able to go out and fix this.
Right.
That's a privilege response because it assumes that these are just technical details.
Right. Well, and the privilege on top of that as well is I have an answer to this.
Precisely.
And it's not the African American community has an answer. It's like, well, hey, so what is it that you really want? Unfortunately, whatever they say does not jive with what I feel needs to happen. Want a great way to help a worthy organization and educate children about the civil rights movement? Visit our foundation, the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation, at thejtmfoundation.org. That's thejtmfoundation.org. We are a 501c3 established to help end racism through education. A $5 monthly recurring donation will provide curriculum for 30 students. As my mother used to say, I can't do everything, but I can do something, because doing nothing is not an option. If you have wanted to help in this cause, but didn't know how, now you can. The Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation at thejtmfoundation.org.
Here's why it doesn't jive within this frame of privilege. Because the solution that I as a white person bring to the table is going to reflect my own lived experience.
Right.
And so that is fundamental privilege. When I believe the world will work best when it reflects the way I've lived in the world, that is fundamental privilege. That is the most basic privilege that can exist. The world should be a carbon copy of me.
Right.
If I don't like loud people, then you're supposed to speak softly. If I put weight in someone standing up and expressing themselves strongly and taking over the conversation, then that's what I want to see.
Mm-hmm.
If I believe that a well-cut lawn is a reflection of a well-ordered soul and mind, then when I see an uncut lawn, I believe that person is not ordered.
Right.
And so
There's
I'm
something
always
inherently wrong with them at that point.
exactly. And it is not a reflection of the other person, it's a reflection of me.
But it's through that fundamental privilege that you see the world.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting because I think about how guilt can come into that when your behaviors don't match up with your values. And so this is where this suddenly again, it's like, well, the protests take place. Well, wait a second. I thought everything was fine. And of course, these behaviors of protesting don't match up with my values. But now all of a sudden, you're starting to get people who are feeling guilty going, oh my gosh, I had no idea what's going on here.
But think about this as well. How many people are showing up in these protests? White people showing up in these protests
Right.
because they passionately hate Trump.
Right.
And so they're showing up to protest because they believe the protest reflects their own dislike of Trump.
Right.
Rather than showing up to protest because law enforcement fundamentally is fractured in the way it treats people of color. And so, yes, they'll intellectually support that. That's right. Oh, Trump's just a symbol of how corrupt the police system is.
Well, and does privilege come into the aspect of so I had posted about the police in Buffalo. All right. So this is the police officers who knock over this old white guy, 75-year-old white guy. Now, one would assume that white people would watch that and go, oh my gosh, that's me. One would assume. One person's defensive response was, you have to be really ignorant to assume that white police officers are just hunting down black people. And it's like, okay, that's not what anyone is saying.
No.
But again, it's this detachment and this defensiveness that comes in that's part of that privilege of how the world should be.
Right. Yep.
It's always centered. So, Curtis, in a nutshell, white privilege, give that to me in a nutshell.
Okay, so white privilege is a subconscious experience where I believe that the way the rest of the world works is the way it has worked for me.
Right.
And so the challenge with that is that that's not as painful a definition as, some activists would prefer.
Right.
And it also takes a lot of work to understand that. It's not precisely clear. And so but it's understanding the simplicity of, well, so let me go all the way back. Actually, I've never thought about tying this together, but let's go back to my first lesson of race that I shared from Glenn on that first day that I sat through one of his workshops.
Right.
And at the end of the day, he says, believe me, just believe me.
Right.
And so fundamental privilege is that I believe the world best functions in the way that has worked for me. Then the first way to start challenging that privilege is to believe people when they say it functions differently for me.
Right.
And so it's giving credence, it's giving credibility, it's giving value to the fact that someone walks up and says, oh no, I've been treated differently.
Right. And that's not an attack on you. That's just, and that's part of the problem is that people.
It's just reality. It's just the
like,
way.
hey, well, look, and I've said this in a previous podcast. Your white ignorance is not the same as a black person's experience, but the problem is we start to personalize that. And so when a person of color says, I got pulled over by the police for no reason, and then they did this, and this, and all of a sudden we get defensive about that.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we possibly there's no reason to get defensive about that. Someone's just explaining what happened to them. And yes, that's different than you.
Yeah, but this is because our worldview is centered on us. So let me use this example of Nordstrom's. So Nordstrom's, a lovely store, right? I mean, go in and it's like, my brother was a manager at Nordstrom's. The service they give, the fact they'll return anything, it's an amazing store. And I remember Glenn talking about going into Nordstrom's and feeling really uncomfortable because they followed him everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm centered within my own white privilege, when Glenn says, I don't like Nordstrom's because they follow me, my response is going to be, oh, that's because they just want to give you good service.
Mm-hmm.
So I've taken my experience and I've placed it on Glenn. I'm expecting him to interpret the world the way I've interpreted it,
Mm.
rather than just giving Glenn the full space to say, I don't like Nordstrom's because they follow me. I'm a black man. They're walking around making sure I don't steal anything.
Right.
Well, obviously, that's not my experience because I'm white. So when I go in there, I'm just expecting service. So we can both have a different experience of equal value. And if I really want to challenge my privilege, I'm going to make sure that the differences in experiences are highlighted.
But you have to be willing to accept the idea that there are other experiences and that those
Exactly.
experiences come through a history. And so if you don't even recognize the history of
Right.
what's going on in America, I mean, you can, yeah, okay, I get it. There was slavery. Yeah, I get it. There was Jim Crow. But the compounding effect of that, we tend to ignore and how we even benefited from that.
Yeah. So, one of the aspects of this, how do we challenge privilege? So, we challenge privilege by acknowledging its existence,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't fix privilege by eliminating the privilege itself. So, let me explain this. So, let's go back to driving while black and driving while white.
Right.
So, we need to end the privileged experience of driving while white. So to end that, well, why don't we go out and make sure cops randomly pull over everybody? Let's make sure that cops drag people out of their car when they reach for their wallets. Everybody, no matter their skin color. Let's make sure that everybody is afraid of the cops. We've ended privilege. Now, we haven't ended privilege. We've, in essence, legitimized authoritarianism.
Right.
So to end privilege is to make sure that everybody is treated nicely by the cops. Make sure no one is pulled over unless there is a clear and absolute violation of the law.
Mm-hmm.
That everybody has the freedom to reach over and find their wallet. That everybody gets off on a warning. We actually end privilege by taking that privilege and giving it to everybody, whatever their skin color, their ethnicity, their gender, their livelihood, their education level, all the rest may be. And so in a store, let's go to Nordstrom's, no one should be followed
Mm-hmm.
based on the color of their skin, ever. But good service should be given to everybody.
Right.
So it's like, Nordstrom, you need to end your privilege. Make sure you trail everybody and document everything everybody is touching. That's not a solution to privilege.
No.
The solution to privilege is whoever you are, you walk in the door, and we are going to treat you exactly for who you are.
A lot of white people really feel that when you say you're giving someone rights, it's taking it away from them. And that even though they might not recognize or want to admit to privilege, at the same time, they're going, well, wait a second. If you're going to start balancing the scales, that means I'm going to start losing something and I'm going to lose that advantage, that privilege that they don't admit to, but subconsciously is there.
But this is where they have to live true to their values. So let's take it from an economic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Being anti-immigrant because it takes jobs away from Americans.
Right.
Well, you were never promised that job to begin with. If someone else shows up who's willing to work harder for it, they get it.
Right.
And so if you've taken your privilege to such a level that you believe you should be given something rather than earning it, even if your public profession is you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps,
Mm-hmm.
you're off in your worldview to begin with.
Right.
No, I mean, eliminating privilege is making sure that everybody gets a fair chance at competing.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting as well. Just saying this, just thinking about that out loud for a moment here is, oh, you should pull yourself up by the bootstraps, but don't let the immigrants in because I don't want them to do that.
Right. Because frankly, they're going to outwork me.
Right.
They're going to outwork me, outthink me, outlast me, the whole thing. And then my entitlement is threatened, not just my privilege.
Right.
I mean, let's face it, white America is really entitled.
Yeah.
And we've just become very good at being quiet about it.
Mm-hmm.
And within that entitlement, we can always find blame. And so I just want to circle back to, my experience being a white man, having to come to this. Why did I have to go down this route of understanding my own privilege? It's because if I did not, I would not be able to fully believe my children.
Right.
And so let's go back to this driving while black versus driving while white.
Yeah.
So my son comes home and he is rattled because he was pulled over and he was scared. And when he comes in the door, he is relying upon me, as any child would, for me as a parent to stand up for him, to support him within his emotional trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because this is an emotional and not an intellectual moment, if I have not deeply reviewed my own lived experience, I am going to say to him, what did you do wrong?
Right.
I love you. I support you. I'm here for you. But I want to make sure you didn't do anything wrong, because my lived experience is that I've always been pulled over. I've only been pulled over when I've been caught, when I've been doing something wrong. And so if at that critical moment when my black son is looking at his white father and saying, do you really get me? If my response questions his lived experience, he will come to no longer trust me. Because I don't get it. I don't get it. And so I have to have that discipline to step back at a moment and go, I'm going to give you your full space at this moment to be exactly who you are.
Right. And this makes me think as well, is that so your son or a friend, coworker, whatever it might be, someone who's of a color, and in your example, your son, what did you do wrong? Were you speeding? Were you this? You're asking these questions because we're trying to get to the bottom of this. Again, like you're saying, from our experience as a white experience. But it's like, really, Dad? Really? It's like, well, hey, look, buddy, I'm just trying to check off the boxes here. I'm just trying to understand what's going on. No, you're not. You're not trying to understand what's going on. You're trying to justify what took place through your experience, not through your son's experience.
Exactly.
So there's this part about this. So we could talk about all this, white privilege forever, but how do we rewrite this narrative? And there's something you talk about very early on, a couple of years ago when we were making the film. There's a scene in the film where you're talking and stuff. It's all slow-mo and there's nice music and people are nodding their heads and so forth.
Good editing, Loki. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a really beautiful moment. I love the music in there. But the four forces and counterforces of privilege.
Yeah.
Thank you again for listening. Make sure you head to my Patreon page at patreon.com/Loki Mulholland. Show a little love if you can, and get access to even more content. Until next time, don't be afraid to get uncomfortable.